Venerable nuns, ladies and gentlemen, I am Venerable Khamsin Kumara from SSBU. I am going to be your MC for this afternoon lecture. Welcome to this special event marking the 52nd birthday anniversary of Oxford Sayadaw, Professor Dr. Khammai Dhammasami, the founder of SSBU. To keep you informed once again, we have finished 9 lectures of 11 lectures we planned. We left 2 lectures. Now we will start our lecture. Before the commencement of the lectures, may I present the agenda of the lectures. Today, we have only one section. It is from 1 to 2:45. As for today's agenda, the first lecture is Neurodynamics of a Mindful Brain by Dr. Elena Antonova from King's College, London. The second one is Effective Buddhist Leadership based on integration of conditions of welfare for a nation, Aparihaniya Dhamma, and 7 Habits Theory by Venerable Pandava, PhD candidate from MCU. At the end of each paper presentation, there will be presenting certificates of appreciation, souvenirs, and presents to both speakers. After all, to close the lecture program, there will be collective recitation of a short Pali stanza, Buddha Sasanam Silang Detadu. Now, as we are moving on the commencement our academic lectures program, to begin the presentation, as first, I would like to invite Dr. Elena Antonova to come to the stage or to come here. Before starting the academic lectures, please allow me to introduce Dr. Elena Antonova. Dr. Elena Antonova is a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, King's College, London. Her main research interest is the neuroscience of mindfulness, particularly structural and functional brain changes. In long-term mindfulness, practitioners from the Tibetan Buddhist traditions of Dzogchen and Mahamudra. She has been actively involved with the Mind and Life Institutes, an organization that aims to facilitate an interdisciplinary research into the aspects of contemplative practices. Doctor, you have 1 hour for presentation, including questions and answers. So now it is your time for presentation. Therefore, take your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's my absolute pleasure to visit Myanmar. I always wanted to come, so this is a wonderful opportunity. I do apologize in advance if I'm sometimes speaking a bit too fast. Please just give me a sign to slow down. As I was joking in the car, Asian people have a quick mind and relaxed body, and Western people, myself included, have a speedy mind and tight body. So I will try to shift myself into first gear, but do slow me down if I start speeding up. Also, there's quite a lot of pictures of the brain and the names that will be unusual and familiar, so I will try to explain everything as simply as I can. But scientists tell us that the brain is one of the most complex things in the universe, so I might not always be able to completely simplify it. Another disclaimer I wanted to make is if anything doesn't agree with the Theravadan view of Buddhism, because Buddhism is such a diverse school of thought and practices, and my knowledge primarily is from Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Vajrayana, and also Dzogchen and Mahamudra that teach about non-dual awareness. So my knowledge of all the traditions of Buddhism is not so good. So I do apologize if unintentionally I will say something that is inaccurate. So I will start by giving you a little bit of historical background and understanding of how the word mindfulness made its way to the Western clinical practice and science. Because what we mean by mindfulness now in the West is not necessarily what is meant by the word sati. And I'll talk about it a little bit more. I will also talk about stages of mindfulness practice and how this reflects on the brain dynamics. I will show you some of my preliminary work with Tibetan Buddhist practitioners of what we call non-dual mindfulness or open presence, so that's Dzogchen and Mahamudra. And then I'll show you a couple of examples of how mindful brain, how different it looks when it has to engage with some action or some task compared to someone who is not meditator. So to define mindfulness as to how I'm going to be using it sometimes. So in the word in Sanskrit, as you well know, is smriti and sati in Pali. And in those languages, colloquially, it simply means memory. Remembering the past, thinking about the future, or recollecting in general. In meditation context, it means keeping guard. And in the cognitive psychology, we have a concept of working memory. So sort of monitoring on a moment-by-moment basis what mind is doing, what is occupied in the mind. And depending on which practice we're engaged in, we're going to be mindful of different things. But regardless of what we're practicing, particularly for the beginner, we are mindful of mind's natural tendency to be distracted. Distracted away from the task, being absorbed into its immediate content. So those tendencies is something that we mindfully observe whatever practice we engage in. This gentleman, Thomas William Rhys-Davids, he was a British scholar who introduced Theravadan Buddhism into the West, and he made the first entry into a Pali-English dictionary. It was a sort of first edition at the time, and as you can see, sati is translated as many different things: memory, recognition, consciousness, And mindfulness is only one definition. Wakefulness of the mind and lucidity of the mind is probably the closest to what mindfulness means for a Westerner these days. You're probably familiar with this gentleman, Mahasi Sayadaw. He popularized Theravadan Buddhism, particularly in America, which became known as insight meditation. And he had a huge influence on a lot of what now they call themselves mindfulness teachers in the West. So this tradition is very close to what I think you practice here. And he popularized the 4 foundations of mindfulness to the Westerners: mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of the feeling, mindfulness of the thought, and mindfulness of the phenomena or mind processes. Then Nyapanika Thera was a German-born Sri Lankan Theravadan monk, and he popularized the notion of mindfulness as a bare attention. And what he meant by bare is it's stripped out of any judgment or any conceptual thinking. It's just purely paying attention to whatever is going on in the mind or the body at any particular moment. And this definition, again, had a huge influence on this gentleman, John Kabat-Zinn, who is the person who became mindfulness, who made mindfulness what it is in the West. And he designed this intervention that is called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And it's very much based on 4 foundations of mindfulness. But he also had a lot of Zen Buddhism influence in his own practice, which then translated in the way he presents and teaches mindfulness to the Westerners. And in the West, when people present on mindfulness, they often quote this line from one of his books, which kind of became a golden standard definition of mindfulness. And as you can see, it's attention is a key to it as well. So paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, meaning with intention, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Non-judgmental doesn't mean, it doesn't have any reference to ethics. Non-judgmentally means in equanimity, so without this automatic liking, disliking judgment. Okay, I will not talk much about these definitions, but this is just to emphasize that in the West, when we say mindfulness, we don't just mean attention or sati, we also mean certain attitude, certain quality with which we attend to things that present themselves. And the full quote from John Kabat-Zinn is that actually the way he speaks about it, that mindfulness is awareness and certain quality of awareness that arises when we're paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So hopefully from this, you see that when we say mindfulness in the West, we mean much more. So we mean already a certain way of being, a certain way of awareing things, and a certain way we orient to the experience. This table is from one of the scientific papers by Antoine Lutz, and he and his colleagues, they kind of schematically broke down the stages of practice, which I think are quite common across different traditions. So when we start the practice, we often have some object of practice. So if it's Vipassana, maybe it's a mindfulness of body, it could be mindfulness of breath, it could be an external object like a candle or a tanka, but there is some kind of a object upon which we rest our mind. And then at a later stage of the practice, in the second stage, we start to become aware of the subject of meditation. We start to begin to ask questions about who is the meditator, who is performing the practice. And then at a later stage, there's distinctions, this differentiation between the subject and object of meditation become more and more soft, more and more blurred. And a fourth stage would represent an enlightened being, whereby any subject-object distinctions have dissolved. So what does the brain look like in someone who's at the first stage of practice, when we mainly have a focus of meditation, some kind of an object? Now I have to introduce you to some networks in your brain. Okay? So the ones that you see in blue, and this is the front of the brain, yeah, this is the back, and this is the midline. So if I cut through the brain this way, that would be the midline. So as you can see, those areas in blue, those are what we call, I'll keep them if I need them, thank you very much. Those are the areas in the brain that become active when we pay attention on purpose, when we control our attention by focusing, for example, on my lecture, or when we're focusing our attention on the breath or sensations of the body, or it can be external sounds, but it's that willfully bringing it and holding it, sustaining it. Now, the areas in the red, this is attention network. We call it bottom-up or saliency network. That is activates, like if there was a sudden loud noise outside of this room, and you paying actively attention to my lecture, that network will disrupt your focused attention and orient your senses towards that loud sound. And then you can quickly evaluate whether we need to run or whether it's okay to stay. And if you decide it's okay to stay, that network will disengage and you'll bring the top-down one back online. Or if there are too many noises and it feels shaky, we might decide it's time to run, and we'll be listening more to that network. Yes? So one is willful, another one picks up whatever is the most salient stimuli in our environment. And for example, people, I don't know if you have this diagnosis in Myanmar, attention deficit, attention ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So children and adults who have this disorder, that saliency network constantly interrupts the top-down one. So one is called top-down, the other is called bottom-up. And that's why mindfulness practice is very good for them, because it strengthens the bottom-up network and makes them less destructible. So when, as I said, when we engage that first network, blue network, we have the flow of the information in the brain from the prefrontal cortex to the other areas. We call it top-down flow. This is a very busy slide, but this is a study of very experienced meditators from Tibetan Buddhist tradition when they were practicing shamatha with support, so shamatha with the object. And they were compared to expert meditators. So the first row is the expert, and then you have, they say novices, but these are people who were recruited from American city, asked to meditate just for 1 week, and then they were compared to the experts. And as you can see, in experts, the networks that we know associated with very good focus are more active than in people who are novices. And in the bottom row, when you compare, when you subtract the image for the meditators from the novices, those are the areas that are the most activated, and those are the ones that we know involved in this very focused attention. So what happens with the brain when we start softening up the subject of meditation? I have to introduce you to more brain networks. And now in yellow, those are the attention networks, the top and the bottom network that I presented before. And the areas in green and blue are very interesting because about 10 years ago, when Western neuroscientists became interested in Buddhism, quite a few of them, they started popularly say that neuroscience has proven, as Buddha was always saying, that there is no self. They said there's no self in the brain. Brain is a kind of self-organizing thing. But around the same time, when we started using fMRI scanners, those big magnets, when we put people in the scanner and give them a task to do, often what scientists did, they will study some attention to some kind of stimuli, visual maybe, or maybe words, and then to contrast, to see, because with the fMRI you can't see what is precisely happening in the brain. You can only see it in comparison to something else. So you always need to give another task or another state to be able to say, brain is more active in these areas when we're doing X as compared to Y. So as a comparison state, they started asking people just to rest in the scanner. Well, if you were a non-meditator, an average Westerner, who's asked to rest whilst being scanned, would your mind be completely blank? The answer is no, it's not a trick question. So the mind is going to be very busy with all sorts of things, like thoughts about the past or the future, maybe ruminations about what just happened, maybe some daydreaming, some fantasies. So we call it mind wandering. And it's all about me, me, me. So the word we use is self-referencing. So scientists then realized that actually we do have the network in the brain that is active when we have this sense of separate psychological self. Yes? And these are the areas that they found to be associated with this network. So the green at the front of the brain here, these are the areas that activate when we have this psychological sense of self. And slightly above here are the areas that activate when we, it's our sort of social self, when we think how others see us. And then this area at the back, called posterior cingulate, and it's sort of midline there. This area gives us a kind of egocentric mapping of the body in relation to the environment. So it's kind of our bodily self that feels separate from our environment. And then this prefrontal cortex self here builds on that bodily self, right? So this bodily self is kind of necessary for us to walk around so we don't bump into things. But that psychological self is kind of creates the sense of us being psychologically separate. This is just summarizing it. And then we call it default mode network. And why it's became known as default mode is that it's active in Westerners, not necessarily everyone, but in Westerners, when they're left to their own devices in the scanner, and the monkey mind starts turning its ways. Yeah? And if you ask someone to think about the past, to think about the future in relation to themselves, the same network becomes active. So it's been pretty well proven now that that's what it does. So, okay, let me talk about this study. This was a study of this mindfulness-based stress reduction program that I have mentioned to you before. It's an 8-week program, and it starts with mindfulness of the body, and then it proceeds to mindfulness of feeling, and then mindfulness of thought, and then choiceless awareness, or sort of mindfulness of phenomena. And these scans were taken from Western people, healthy people, who were naive to meditation before the program. They were scanned before they started this 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and then 8 weeks after. And they were given in the scanner adjectives such as stressed, relaxed, greedy, generous. And they were asked to either self-reference, see how those adjectives relate to their persona that they have of themselves, their view of themselves, or in alternative condition, they were asked just to remain mindfully aware of whatever thoughts, feelings, sensations they became aware of when they were presented with those words. And here we can see those areas in blue. These are the middle and the top middle parts that I've showed you before that associate when we think about our personal self or our social self. Those were activated when they were not being mindful. And then when they were mindful, they had areas of the brain activated. One of them is here called insula. And this is the area that gives us the awareness of our body sensations. Or we call it interoceptive awareness. And then this area here is lateral prefrontal cortex. So the top of the head, so front of the head, prefrontal cortex, on the lateral outside rather than in the middle. And this is a classical area in neuroscience which activates when we use working memory. So that's sati in its sort of classical sense. Yeah, so being aware, monitoring moment by moment what the mind is doing.